I'm going to talk about the fraud aspect of this because it is very serious. This is, if properly understood, the largest attempt at financial and scientific fraud that has ever been perpetrated on mankind by a few profiteers wishing to take advantage of scientific ignorance on the part of the political class, on the part of the general public, and in particular on the part of the news media. And let us just take the most obvious example of outright fraud. Now, first of all, let me define fraud. Fraud, as it is classically understood in jurisprudence worldwide, is the obtaining of a pecuniary or financial advantage by deception. So there are two tests that have to be passed. First of all, there has to be deception. And secondly, there has to be at least the prospect, even if it's not actually realized, of gaining a financial advantage by that deception. Now, with that definition of fraud in mind, let us look at Albert Arnold Gore, a former Vice President of the United States. Heaven knows why he, of all people, was chosen to be Vice President, but he was. He was one of the most inadequate and pathetic performers in that role that I have ever seen. Here was a man who claimed that he believed we needed to save the planet from this imagined threat of global warming, and yet during his presidency of the Senate voted 95-0, even he didn't vote, 95-0, to reject the Kyoto Treaty or any treaty like it that tried to bind the United States to destroy its own economy from within by shutting down its coal industry and its coal-fired power industry and its gasoline industry and its natural gas industry, while allowing countries like China and India not to be similarly bound. 95-0. So that's how ineffective he was as Vice President of the United States in what he tells us is his passion, which is the global warming subject. So now we look at his mawkish sci-fi comedy horror movie, and in that movie, a judge in the United Kingdom High Court found 9 errors, all of them errors tending towards climate extremism, tending towards inventing a problem where it didn't exist and then exaggerating it beyond all reason or practicality. And the overall assessment of the judge was that the Armageddon scenario that Gore depicts in that movie, and these are the judge's words, is not based on any scientific view. That was the judge's finding. The judge said that when Gore said that sea level was imminently going to rise by 20 feet, he can't have meant it because he himself had just bought a condo feet from the supposedly rising ocean at Fisherman's Wharf, San Francisco, for $4 million. He himself didn't believe that lie. And sea level, according to the UN's climate panel, is only going to rise at about 1 foot per century, maximum 2. So that was knocked out by the judge. He also knocked out a suggestion by Gore that people were having to leave various Pacific atolls because the rising seas were swamping them. He said there was no evidence for any such thing happening and no evidence that it was going to happen. Then he said polar bears, according to a study that he referred to, Monnet and Gleason, 2006, were being killed because they were swimming more than 60 miles to find the ice which was melting away in the Arctic. However, I went back and looked at that paper, and then we put this in front of the judge, and it showed a map of the Beaufort Sea, and it showed 4 dead polar bears, which had been discovered in an aerial overflight. And they had died not because of global warming, according to the paper that Gore himself had said had attributed to global warming, but because there had been a very heavy rainstorm and a very heavy winds and very high seas, and the bears had simply got swamped. As we scientists put it, happens. So what happened is polar bears died for natural reasons, nothing whatever to do with global warming. And the judge was very angry about that one. He said there is no evidence that polar bears are at any way at risk as a result of global warming. And there were a number of other errors. For instance, Al Gore said, oh, but you know, the snows of Kilimanjaro are receding. Yes, they are. They've been receding since 1880, long before we had anything to do with it. Half the snow had gone before 1936, when Hemingway wrote his great novel of that name, The Snows of Kilimanjaro. And the reason why the snow has gone is nothing to do with global warming, because in the last 30 years, according to NASA's satellites, there has been regional cooling there. And that cooling of the atmosphere has caused it to dry out. And so the ice is not melting. It's sublimating straight from the solid state, which is ice, into water vapor without going through the liquid phase of being water in between. Nothing whatever to do with global warming. In fact, the summit temperature has never risen above minus 1.6 Celsius in the whole of the last 30 years, and has been at an average of minus 7 Celsius during that time, and you can't melt ice at any temperatures like that. So that too was nonsense. Now, the point is that Al Gore continues to go around the world, even after the High Court judgment against him, peddling the same lies. His movie is still shown in schools without any corrections. In most cases, they have shown this movie as though every word of it were correct. He has taken no steps whatsoever to correct the entirely false impression of the scale of the disaster that we might imagine will happen from global warming, even though that High Court judgment made it very plain that indeed 77 pages of corrective guidance had to be made in the United Kingdom as a result of that judgment. 77 pages that the judge ordered to be circulated to every school in England to correct the nonsense in that movie. But did Gore then remake the movie? It wouldn't have been expensive to take out these and various other errors in it. Did he? Heck, of course he didn't. And he has an investment vehicle. It is called the Generation Investment Management. It's based in London. And every time he makes a speech or writes an article, as he did just a few days ago, as we record this, in the New York Times, saying we're still faced with an enormous catastrophe, even though the judge has told him we're not, then what he does is he is offering a false prospectus in his Generation Investment Management investment company, and that is fraud, because it is a deception. We know that he knows he's wrong, because the judge has told him so, and because he bought that condo in the very year when he was telling us sea level was about to rise by 20 feet and swamp it, and he simply wouldn't have spent $4 million if he'd expected that to happen for a single moment. So we know that he knows he is deceiving the public. It is deliberate. We also know that what he is saying is false. We also know that he is profiting, thanks to that investment vehicle, to the tune of several hundred millions of dollars as a result of his lies. And they are lies. He knows perfectly well that he's getting this wrong. Now that is fraud. That passes all the tests for fraud. And in fact, it also passes the test for racketeering, because it is happening across international borders and on a very large scale. So under the federal RICO statute, he is guilty of racketeering, which carries a maximum sentence, I believe, of life imprisonment. And perhaps life in prison would be the best thing for Al Gore. There he could reflect on the number of people whose lives he has wrecked, on the number of people whose fortunes he has destroyed. I began looking at Pachauri when I went to Copenhagen, and I attended a lecture by him at the university there in December of 2009 during the UN climate conference there, which was such a spectacular failure. And his lecture was rather a failure too, because it contained 18 dismal scientific errors, each of which either invented a problem where there wasn't one, or then it exaggerated it beyond all reason. And one of those errors was one I'd seen him perpetrate before, which also occurs 3 times, large and in full colour, in the United Nations 2007 Fourth Assessment Report on the Climate. And that is a graph which purports to show, but does not in reality show, that the rate of warming has itself increased over the last 160 years, since the temperature record measured by real thermometers began worldwide. Now, in fact, this graph uses a notoriously bogus statistical technique, where the same stochastic or jiggly-uppy-downy data set where you don't know which way it's going to jump next, has multiple trend lines calculated starting at different points arbitrarily chosen by the person trying to produce the false result. So that you can show that if you go back 150 years, it's a very, very gentle increase in temperature. 100 years, it's more steeper. 50 years, steeper still. 25 years, really, really steep. And this is intended to suggest that as you go up towards the right, towards our own time, so by stated implication, our effect on the climate is accelerating the rate of warming. Now, this is in fact complete nonsense. Clear away railroad engineer Paciori's railroad lines, all these multiple trend lines on that data set, and look at the data set on its own. And you find that there have been 3 rates of warming that are identical, and which are the most rapid rates of warming in the whole 160-year record. One of them, sure enough, is the one identified by the UN in its bogus graph between 1975 and 2001 at a rate of warming of 0.16 Celsius per decade. But exactly the same rate of warming also occurred between 1910 and 1940, and also occurred between 1860 and 1880. So there were 3 separate rapid warming rates during the instrumental record, and there was no difference in the rate between them. They were all at 0.16 Celsius per decade. So we don't know what caused the first 2, but we do know that it wasn't CO2, because we weren't emitting enough in those earlier periods to have caused significant warming. If you believe the UN's exaggerated influence of CO2 over temperature, it is in theory possible to pretend that we might have contributed to some degree to the 3rd period of warming by adding CO2. And yet, if we did, then why wasn't that rate of warming any more rapid than the previous 2 where we couldn't have had any effect? None of this is discussed by Paciori or, of course, by the IPCC, because it doesn't fit the picture of alarm that this bogus graph is trying to create. So I had a good look at that 3rd period of warming, and I found that because that falls largely in the satellite era, from 1983 until 2001, we can actually establish what caused that warming, and it was caused by a naturally occurring and transient reduction in cloud cover worldwide. And what does that mean? Fewer clouds, more sunlight gets down and hits the tropics, and if you're in the tropics and it's cloudy, it's a heck of a lot cooler than when it's sunny. Very elementary stuff, this. And so wherever the sun falls on the tropics and there are clouds in the way, the sunlight's reflected back into space. If the clouds aren't there, it gets down and heats the surface. And so there is a very clear and entirely sufficient explanation of why that 3rd period of warming, attributed by the UN to us, actually occurred. So when I had seen all this, I went to that lecture and I gave Dr. Paciori a 10-page letter from me setting out why this graph is bogus, why we know perfectly well that applying multiple trend lines to a single stochastic data set is an impermissible statistical technique. I even demonstrated that if you chose different starting points, you could make it look as though the rate of warming was slowing down rather than accelerating. What does that demonstrate? It demonstrates that if I can get a completely different result using the same technique on the same data, then it is the technique that is at fault. That's why it's a bogus technique. I explained all this. And I said, you have 48 hours, Dr. Paciori, to come back to me and accept that this is yet another mistake in the UN's climate panel's reports. You will withdraw it, you will no longer use it in your own lectures, and you will publicly apologize for it and say that it won't happen again. And if you don't, I said, I will be reporting you to the authorities for criminal fraud.